Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Welcome everybody to the third session of Esoteric Antecedents of Thelema. And we're going to be talking about Platonism today. And we're going to be talking about it through a look at the Platonic doctrines of Albinus, which is a Middle Platonic it's a textbook basically from the Roman Empire in the 200s of the Common Era, and it's a summarization of Platonic doctrine. And that makes it doubly valuable. First of all, it's a useful summary of Platonism as understood in Roman philosophy. And secondly, it is a glimpse into the academic pedagogy of its time and the way that philosophy was integrated with a kind of educational system called the paideia that was shared in common by all members of the educated classes within the Roman Empire. And so it's a kind of common language and culture, training in rhetoric and philosophy that unites a common intellectual culture in ancient times. And this is, of course, greatly envied later in Latin Christendom, where there's a significant loss of that educational cohesiveness, and in particular, a kind of breakdown of a centralized imperial bureaucratic order, what's called the Pax Romana of Rome. And this created a stable economic system that supported a high level of culture over a large area. And in the Middle Ages, so-called, in Western Europe, things were a lot more sketchy, and it was harder to keep it together, particularly to maintain a high level of culture. Now, there's a kind of re-urbanization that occurs in the High Middle Ages, say about the 1200s, and this creates a university culture that is then the basis for what you might call scholasticism, the philosophies of Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, and a number of intellectual figures, some of whom did write on natural magic and theological subjects that could be considered mystical, and so in a way are part of a tradition we can think of ourselves as still part of. But this older idea of antiquity, and particularly the philosophical systems and learning, was maintained more in a piecemeal fashion until we get to the Renaissance, when there's the rediscovery of a large number of important texts. And this included the complete works of Plato, and of course the Corpus Hermeticum, which we talked about 2 weeks ago. And then that gave rise to the Renaissance Magi, which are our direct modern predecessors of our own tradition. We're not going to be looking directly at the Platonic dialogues because there's too many of them. This is a Bible paper edition of all the dialogues, coming in at about 1,700 pages. And there's certain key texts, but it would require their own class sessions to kind of work through that. And instead, we're going to take this useful summary and use it. And the other reason that this is useful is because the period in question that this is a summary of Platonism from is the period that the Hermetic texts that we looked at earlier are also from. And so the Platonism that's in this text is, at least for our purposes, functionally the same as the Platonism that's represented in the Hermetic texts. So it represents a kind of common Roman era understanding of Platonism. And then that's going to be superseded in time in the late Roman Empire. We're going to look at this in the next few weeks, something called Neoplatonism, which is a more substantive Platonic revival, which doesn't just repeat the doctrines of previous versions of Platonism, but elaborates complex new theories and ways of staging out the system. And what's important about Neoplatonism is that in many ways, Plotinus and Iamblichus represent, for us as neo-pagan magicians, as theurgists, they're like our Augustine. Iamblichus and Plotinus are our Augustine. Augustine being the great synthesizer of Platonism and Christianity, who emerges as the kind of the last of the church fathers, because later in Augustine's life, Rome gets sacked by some barbarians, so-called, basically the empire politically falls and is no longer able to maintain a centralized functioning political bureaucracy. And Augustine has just enough time to put his codex of writings in order and have them produced en masse in his scriptorium and then distributed throughout the empire. And so he's one of the major figures of antiquity that we have basically all of his writings compiled together by him in kind of a uniform edition where there's not a lot of gaps, because and then for Christians, he interprets the Christian tradition and the earlier church fathers for them. And so in the Middle Ages, when they're trying to figure out what Christianity is supposed to be, Augustine is kind of their model to how to read the otherwise much more diverse and complex and internally difficult to reconcile patristic tradition. Never mind internal inconsistencies in the actual biblical texts between competing forms of Christianity, all of which are kind of mashed together in the New Testament collection of texts. So for us, as people interested in magic and how magic might have been practiced in antiquity as a kind of more or less explicit antecedent tradition historically to our own genealogy of practice, ancient Platonism and particularly Neoplatonism occupies a kind of privileged position among the texts that survive that are available to us. And so that's why I've given them such an important place in basically the rest of this course, because what these texts say about magic is then what magic kind of means for the classical scholars in the Renaissance, and then moving forward from there into the modern tradition of magic, culminating in Aleister Crowley's writings and then our own tradition. This is the genealogy of ideas, that there's a more or less coherent body of philosophical debate and engagement with certain themes. And that's the pattern that then permutates itself through history, and that we're still iterating the linguistic symbolic threading of that particular set of ideas. And this provides or can provide a theoretical basis for understanding the Thelemic tradition, and therefore ourselves as practitioners in it, and give us information about who we are and what we're doing, which I think is ultimately the one way, at least, of formally categorizing what the true will is supposed to be. It's supposed to be something that tells us who we are and what we're doing. And that's something that is always uniquely personal, but always in an intimate dialogue with the whole of our historical context. And so the context of modern magic is this lineage of ideas that goes back to the Renaissance, and from there then to the classical period, which is now what we're going to be looking at for the rest of the course. Platonism. Okay, so there's a few, before we jump into the text of the Platonic doctrines, I want to say a few things about Platonism generally. This is, of course, as a set of texts, still a living part of our philosophical tradition. I think most undergraduates who take a humanities course are usually reading something of Plato's, maybe the Apology of Socrates or the Republic, or there used to be this department called rhetoric back in the 90s in certain schools. This has been supplanted now by some other terminology. But when I was an undergraduate back in the day, the way it worked is that there was this bifurcation between analytical philosophy and continental philosophy. And analytical philosophy was based a lot more on formal logic and wasn't as historicist in its methodology. You kind of show up as the philosopher as this kind of abstract person from nowhere, and you just sort of land and start doing philosophy. That's kind of supposed to be your attitude, and this is called objectivity, and it's kind of bogus. And what I mean by that, formally, as an actual argument rather than just an emotional reaction, is I think the continental tradition of philosophy, represented by the kind of philosophy that's practiced in France, Germany, other places like that, is more open to a kind of historicized understanding or account of what they're doing, and it's more literary. It's based on treating philosophical texts as a kind of literary tradition that is being subjected to a kind of literary criticism that is not so formally based on logic, but is instead situated within a larger aesthetic theory of culture. And where I'm going with this is that that in a way is a lot more, it provides a better way of getting at what's going on with what Plato's doing in his original dialogues, which is there's this thing I want to talk about again before we get to the text, which we are going to get to in a moment, called Platonic irony. Okay, what do I mean by that? What this designates is the fact that there's certain supposed doctrines of philosophy that are ascribed to Plato, and these include the doctrine of the forms, a number of topics that we're just about to talk about. The later philosophical tradition, particularly including the analytical tradition of philosophy, the Anglo-American, still ongoing version of philosophy, but also the way that Platonism was treated as a set of doctrines in the Roman period after the end of the Athenian Greek period, the age of Pericles, and then the Athenian Empire is challenged in the Peloponnesian Wars, and then they're overrun by the Macedonians, and then the political situation changes. Anyway, by the time you get to the Roman period, Platonism is treated as a more or less closed, fixed set of doctrines. And in a way, this is a kind of falsification of how they're presented in the Platonic dialogues. What I mean by that is not that Plato doesn't have doctrines, that he doesn't have, in this sense, that he doesn't have particular ideas of what he thinks are his solution to particular philosophical problems or discourses that are going on at the time. But these are presented in the discourses in a more speculative, literary fashion than is perhaps the way that these ideas are inframed or understood later. So that when you get to someone like Iamblichus, he treats the system of the universe as described in Plato's dialogues, not as a kind of literary myth illustrating certain philosophical themes or morals, but as a literal scientific description of how the universe, the cosmos, is structured. And then it has these particular layers, and those are literally objectively there, like any phenomenon of physics. And he's got it all mapped out, and he thinks that using theurgic, visionary, ecstatic trances, you can get into objective basically telepathic communication with this divine hierarchy of being that's this organic, all-encompassing fixed framework for the universe, and that when you understand that, you understand what the truth is with a capital T. And you know the truth and all this. And we might call this metaphysics. And it's not quite exactly what's going on in Plato himself, where these are instead presented as the kind of conversations that you might have with your friends at a dinner party, symposii, and you're getting a little tipsy and having a good time, and you're letting your imagination go and seeing how much you can kind of push these themes or ideas and get the broadest kind of story out of it. And just as in the dramatic productions of Aeschylus or Sophocles or whomever, they're taking the more or less literary mythology that comes from Homer and the Homeric myths, that's their common culture, and they're elaborating these dramatic plays, these dramas that are complex metaphors for posing certain ethical or political issues in their culture. Plato's doing the same thing with these dinner party conversations that he's writing up as a kind of literary genre called philosophy. And basically, these are being used as educational texts at his academy, where he's training the youth of the educated classes, the patricians of the property owning classes in Athens. And they're learning rhetoric so that they can represent their interests as property owners in the democratic assembly of the city, which is based around being able to give good speeches, to be persuasive, to get the votes, to get what you want. And if you're a part of a class that participates in that kind of activity, you need to learn rhetoric, speech making, to be able to do that. And so this is part of the paideia. And the Platonic dialogues are then examples of this, or exemplars of this, to learn how to give these persuasive speeches. And so philosophy is then an excellent way to do that. And of course, you're also trying to learn how to be good and all this sort of stuff as well. But then history progresses and things change, and these ideas take on a more dogmatic form. The word dogma refers to church teachings in the Middle Ages, and it becomes a kind of fixed point of reference for what truth with a capital T is supposed to be. See, there's kind of competition going on in the later Roman Empire, where Christians and pagans are in a kind of political contest in terms of what's going to win out as the state religion. And this is going to provide the basic order for society. And what Christians do is they establish doctrine through creeds by having church councils, which are called, Constantine, for example, when he converted the empire to Christianity, calls the Council of Nicaea to decide what the nature of Christ was and other pressing issues of the day. But the point I'm making is that the later pagan magical philosophers, like Iamblichus, Porphyry, and Proclus, are the big three. And they all follow in the wake of Plotinus, who sets up the paradigm with this text called the Aeneids that we're going to look at a little later in this course. They have to compete with an increasingly systematized Christian theology. And so they have to become also in competition, they also imitate, and so they also become more dogmatic. And also, and so pagan philosophy becomes less speculative and more kind of artificially sure of itself. And we should have, I think, a little bit of a hermeneutics of suspicion, so called, towards that attitude that this is a kind, I mean, it's not that they don't believe these things, but that they're having to work harder at believing them than before because of political pressures, or at least differently than occurred before. And so particularly some of the humorous element in Plato's dialogues, which continues in Cicero and philosophical dialogues that say Plutarch is writing, that are contemporary with this text. These are, the sense of humor gets kind of lost in Neoplatonism, and indeed in the late Roman Empire, it's kind of a grim time in a lot of ways. And that's why asceticism and a kind of dualistic world denial are emphasized. And that also means that the dualistic aspect of not only these Gnostic traditions like Manichaeism that have become quite popular, but also more formally pagan philosophy, as well as Christianity, has this kind of grim, ascetic, everything's falling apart, but we've got to soldier on, of these last generations of the Roman Empire who literally can't conceive of a world without the empire. It's unthinkable to them. And yet they know that it's kind of, you could almost say in a Freudian way, that unconsciously they know that, or unconsciously aware that this is nevertheless happening to them, and that they're being overwhelmed by that. The text that we're looking at today is kind of poised between, a little bit more between, in that sort of happier period between Plato and the late Empire of the Pax Romana. And in a way, this is the great period of prosperity and stability in the Roman Empire. Although, of course, with all state formations, that's founded on violence. And so the history of this time involves, in some ways, just as much backstabbing or any other. But for the common people of the empire, the level of warfare is not as great. And so, again, there's this opportunity for literature and philosophy to emerge. I'm going to bring up, I see that screen sharing has been disabled. Taryn, if you could change that so that I can share my screen. I'm going to bring up.
Sure. Sorry about that. Don't know why that's
not a problem.
Oh, I see what the problem is. Okay, 1 second.
Okay. There we go. Okay, I've got to then figure out. Do this, which I did before. There it is. Okay, great. So let's start at the beginning here. And let's see, Luke, would you be interested in starting to read at the beginning where it says, "May the following serve"? You up for that? Great.
Sure. All right. Didascalicos of Albinus. May the following serve as a summary of Plato's principal teachings. Philosophy is a striving after wisdom, or a release and a redirecting of the soul from the body that occurs when we turn ourselves to the intelligible world and the things which truly are. Wisdom is knowledge of the things divine and human.
Okay, let's pause there and just parse that out. So it says philosophy is the striving after wisdom. Okay, so that's compatible with what we might consider the idea of philosophy of, as Charles Peirce says, to make our ideas more clear. Or this would also be the basis of, say, analytical philosophy, where you're attempting to analyze your concepts. And so it's a kind of, and then that becomes, as Wittgenstein liked to think of it, as a kind of self-therapy, where you're review. It's like this philosophy is this second order discipline where you have domains of knowledge that are already in place, and then your job is like as the philosophers, that you're like the language referee, where you come in and you analyze the semantical coherence of the concepts that are being deployed and how those are being used logically in these different other fields, either in science or culture. And you can then serve a role in adjudicating the ultimate usefulness of these ideas within the particular theoretical paradigm that whatever science or humanities that you're looking at is participating in. But Platonism is more than that. Platonism isn't just that. It's this other thing too. It says it's not just a knowledge of things human, it's a knowledge of things divine. And so it's also a kind of mysticism. And here it's entirely appropriate to use the word mysticism, because that's from the Greek, meaning this in Greek and Latin, this is what they're actually calling what they're doing, is what becomes our word mysticism. And it says it's a release and a redirecting of the soul from the body that occurs when we turn ourselves to the intelligible world and the things which truly are. Okay, well, what does that mean? Okay, well, it's a kind of divine ascent where you have a kind of great chain of being, where there's a kind of organic divine hierarchy of being that goes from the higher, which is more good and better and more pure, to the lower, which is less good, more evil, more confused, more made up of parts, more perishable. So the idea is that the body and physical objects and the kind of phenomenal world that we find ourselves in is down at the bottom of this great chain of being. And the goal of spirituality is to exalt the component of the self that is not the body, but which directs the body, which is the rational form of the mind. And by disidentifying one's self with the body and instead preeminently identifying oneself with the best part of the soul, one is then able to rise up to or reconnect with or identify with these higher levels of being. The idea being that what is best in the body, namely the rational part of the soul, participates in, through a kind of analogy of being or similitude of being, to these higher levels of reality, which are therefore also conceived as being like the rational soul, namely of the nature of intelligence. Hence, this domain of being is called the intelligible world. And it's more or less identified with what Plato calls the realm of forms. Okay, well, what's that? Basically, Plato agrees with the philosopher Heraclitus that and I'm repeating now what Aristotle says about Plato. So, and that Aristotle is a useful source of information because he knew Plato personally and studied at his academy before he set up shop in Athens with his own college, and then created his own writings for that. So he gives us a kind of privileged access to what Plato thought about Plato's philosophy because Aristotle knew Plato. So he's therefore a good source of information. So what does he say? Aristotle says that Plato agreed with the doctrine of Heraclitus that because everything is in flux, Heraclitus says you can't step in the same river twice. Okay, well, that's a metaphor for being as a whole, that everything is in flux over time and subject to change and transformation. A little bit like the Buddhist doctrine that everything is, all reality lacks an abiding self-essence and is therefore subject to passing in and out of being. So the problem with that is that how can we know things when what we're observing is in flux and is indeterminate ultimately? And so there's a kind of skeptical argument that's then that we can't base knowledge on appearances. Instead, we need to base knowledge on realities, which are different than appearances. Well, okay, well, what's that? Well, Plato's solution to this is to say that what's permanent and abiding and ultimately real about things, about reality, is the intelligible forms of things. The intelligibility itself is more real than things or objects that are intelligible. And so it's kind of the reverse of what you might think of as a more common sense, although that term is itself subject to skepticism, viewpoint. So you might think, well, I come across an object and then it's there and I have ideas about it, but my ideas about it are only real insofar as those ideas are in the object and are, and then I'm getting those ideas from the object. And Plato, and that's called naive realism. And most serious philosophers, just to be clear, don't subscribe to that theory. That it's not because it's completely wrong, but it doesn't say enough about how we know things to work. And there's a number of reasons for that that would involve a longer conversation than we have time for right now. But what I will say at this point for this conversation is that this is often the starting point for philosophies, is this conundrum of how do we know things about the world. Plato's solution is that he posits what he calls a realm of forms, which is a supernatural dimension that is in another world from this one, that has the function of imparting form to this world. So there's this other supernatural, spiritual, divine, holy realm of forms, of which the highest form, Plato says, is of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And that this is theos, this is God. Not in the Judeo-Christian Islamic sense of a personal God who acts in history and therefore is to be owed a kind of personal fealty or obedience through the intermediary either of the observance of the law given by Moses or the Messiah identified with the historical Jesus or the prophet, a status claimed by Muhammad. And so you're a follower of one or a practitioner of one or another of these. For Plato, in a pagan context, the civic religion of your polis is going to be more or less different divinities depending on which city you're in. And all of these divinities are intelligible projections or metaphors of this realm of forms, which then infuses and directs spirituality of all of what you could call religion. And at this point, really, with Plato, you could even go so far as to say that he's inventing mysticism. And this is his ultimate value and function, I think, in world culture. And I'll say more about that in just a moment before we return again to this text. Plato is not just the founder of what we now call philosophy in a literary form. Remember, Socrates didn't write anything. He's also a kind of myth maker, and he's really the most important literary compiler and creator of the founding myth of what you could call Western, but not just Western, and again, I'll say more about that in a moment, Western esotericism. And so even though the myths he makes have been superseded by other myths, he's a kind of myth that it's important to back up and go back to and be cognizant of, much like the Homeric epics themselves underlie our contemporary storytelling culture. The Odyssey is a kind of first novel, even though it's not a novel, but it's enough like a novel because, anyway. Okay, so one more thing before we get back to the Platonic doctrines. I was saying that Platonism is the kind of source for what could be called Western esotericism, but then I said not just Western esotericism. And that's a point that I just want to insert here, and maybe we'll have more to say about later, just before we get a little bit more involved with the content of this text, which is, let me put this in the most blunt form possible first. When we're looking back at Greeks and Romans are not white. They're not even European. They're not, the basis for what later becomes what we call Western culture, but they're not themselves Western. They're a cultural heritage that everyone in the world participates in. And it's a mistake to see one group or another having some kind of special prerogative to be the appropriator of, or the true representative of the culture of the Greeks, or the culture of the Romans, or classical antiquity. And I just want to mention that because a lot of the humanities that come out of European culture studies, Wissenschaft culture, that there's a lot of cultural chauvinism that is part of that tradition, particularly in the 19th centuries and during the later colonial period. This is sometimes called, particularly in the say the German language context, what's it called? The enslavement or the dominance of Greece over Germany. There was this guy Winckelmann who wrote this book about how perfect the art culture of antiquity was, and how the art religion of German Romanticism was the true inheritor of that ideal. And so the generation around like Wagner and people really picked that up and ran with it. It wasn't just, I'm kind of picking on Germans here, but it really, this is something that's going on throughout what we could call Western Europe. And so I just want to emphasize that this is a cultural heritage that is for and about everybody. And anybody can come along and look at these texts and make something of them. And that certainly includes Thelemites, and that includes anybody else. And so let's take a look again at the text. Let me now move forward to page The next thing I want to look at is in section 7. There's definition of what's called theology. Okay, so Joseph, if you could start reading at the beginning of
7?
beginning of 7, yes.
Sure. So much for dialectic. Let us now speak about theory. We have already said that one part of it is theology, another physics, and the third mathematics. We have also said that the goal of theology is knowledge of first causes, which are supreme and primordial. The goal of physics is to discover the nature of the universe, to learn what sort of animal man is and what place he occupies in the universe, and whether God exercises providence over everything, and if there are other gods subordinate to him, and finally, what the relationship is between humans and gods. The object of mathematics is to examine the nature of planes and solids and how they are related to both motion and locomotion.
Okay, that's good. So there's our dividing up of philosophy. So dialectic, that's a seems like this big fancy word, but it just means rhetoric. It just means discourse. It's it includes logic as the rules of correct as discriminated from incorrect inference. So, but then there's theory, and then they're saying this is divided up then into 3 parts: theology, physics, and mathematics. Okay. The Platonic tradition is there's this famous story that there was written above Plato, the doorway, the lintel of Plato's Academy was the slogan, let no one who has not learned geometry enter here. So you have this, again, it's this idea of the paideia, these sort of stages of learning, that they're all integrated with each other as part of this knowing of the organic hierarchy of being through a kind of similitude in your own mind where you learn the form of the true. And that's why the goal of theology is said to be knowledge of first causes, which are supreme and primordial. So those are the primordial ideas. So let's look at the definition of that in this text. And that's going to be in section 9. We are also going to look at section 8, but we'll get back to 8. In the meantime, Joe, I think you haven't read anything yet. If you could read us the start of 9.
Okay, 1 second. It starts with the idea.
It says, granted that matter is a first principle. It's the beginning of section 9. Can you see that on your screen?
Okay, oh yeah, okay. Granted that matter is a first principle, Plato admits to the existence of still others. For example, the paradigmatic first principle, and is the ideas. There is also God, the Father and cause of all things. The idea is in relation to God, his thought. In relation to us, it is the first principle in relation to matter. It is measure in relation to the sensible world. It is a model. In relation to itself, it is a reality. For in general, everything that is done with deliberation must be done with respect to something else, as if each thing proceeded from something else. For example, my image comes from me. The model must have pre-existed. Whether or not the model exists externally, each artist possesses within himself the model and imposes his form upon the matter. Platonists define the idea as an external model of things that exist naturally. Most of them do not like.
Let's stop there. Platonists define the idea as an eternal model of things that exist naturally. So there's nature, and then there's the eternal model of nature, which is the realm of forms and it exists as a higher order of things. So again, there's this hierarchy of being, and the goal of philosophy and of spirituality is to climb back up that ladder of being. And again, the way that you do that is through this kind of similitude, by knowing about the form of the great chain of being. You replicate that form in yourself, but because the form of that thing is the supernatural reality of that thing, there's a kind of identification that then occurs, where your idea of truth then means that because truth is understood to be the form or idea of the true, when you have that idea, that's the same as having or being the truth. And so there's this kind of ultimate self-identity with you could say the ground of being, or what is called in the Platonic tradition theos, or the God, or God with a capital G, which again is this kind of first cause, or first idea, first thought, first most ideal image of the whole. Or as Plato says, the good and the true and the beautiful as they are in themselves, as they are in their pure form, not mixed with appearance, not embodied, transcendent, spiritual, and supernatural. You see how this infuses and informs all the ideas that we have in more contemporary modern times of this kind of metaphysical dualism, where there's this world and there's some other supernatural world, whether there's whatever's supposed to be in that. That this type of Platonism is the historical origin of that conception. Now we're going to go forward just a little bit to a little further on the page where it says, "For ideas are the thoughts of God which are eternal." I have it in brackets there. Do you see it? Taryn, if you could read from that point on.
For the ideas are the thoughts of God which are eternal and perfect in themselves. Platonists justify their belief that ideas exist in the following way. Whether God is mind or a being endowed with mind, he will have thoughts, and they will be eternal and immutable. But if this is so, the idea exists. Second, if matter is unmeasured by its very nature, it must acquire measure from something else which is superior to it and immaterial. If the antecedent is admitted, the consequent follows, and in that case, the idea exists and are immaterial sorts of measures. Again, if the cosmos is not such as it is a result of chance, it has been generated not only out of something, but also by something, and this is not yet enough. It has been generated according to a pattern of something. Could that after which it has been made be anything but the idea?
And there we go. And there's several more of these sort of arguments. So I just wanted to go over that to show the kind of style of argumentation in these kinds of texts. And what's important about that is that still at this point, at this moment in the Platonic tradition, there is still an attempt to provide arguments for the positions rather than just stating this is the way the universe is and this is its structure, and the tradition tells us this, and then it's true for that reason. By the time you get to a Christian Platonist like Pseudo-Dionysius, for example, he no longer gives reasons or arguments for this as to why you might think that this description of reality is the case. He just assumes that this is the truth because his authoritative tradition has delivered to him that this is the case. And this is the basic problem with, if I can put this in Thelemic terms, this is the basic problem with Osirian, the Eon of Osiris, that it's not really based on gnosis, it's not really based on knowledge, which has to be based on a kind of, it has to be based on being convinced, it has to be based on some kind of demonstration, or you have to be able to confirm it somehow. But instead it's based on pistis, or faith. And faith doesn't need to be proved or demonstrated or even seem coherent. It just needs to be obeyed, just like the supreme personal God needs to be obeyed in these monotheistic traditions that become dominant during this period. And I want to keep emphasizing how the Hermetic tradition, which includes the Platonic tradition as its basis, are philosophical traditions that are open to debate and change and transformation and deeper insight and complex, interesting argumentation. And it's not just somebody in authority hitting you over the head with what the truth is, and you have to obey or you're going to go to hell. So that's why it's valuable, among whatever other reasons it might be valuable, to look at these type of philosophical texts, which are not Christian imperialist texts, and they might have their own kinds of authoritarianism that's going on in them. They're certainly from a very class-based society where there were masters and slaves, and that would be considered to be normal by people during this time. Nevertheless, they do offer an alternative perspective, an alternative cultural view to the kind of hegemony that gets going in medieval Christendom and then is at the basis for a lot of the authoritarian political systems in Baroque or early modernity and colonialism. And that's precisely why modern philosophy, reemerging in modern times, which includes all of these esoteric philosophies as well. It's not just this kind of secular rationalism. It includes all these other juicy bits. Leibniz was a Rosicrucian. Newton extensively practiced alchemy. Spinoza is a pantheistic mystic. Even someone as sort of wildly skeptical as Nietzsche is infused with a very deep sense of personal spirituality and mission. I think it's legitimate to say that about him. And so, but it's precisely the revival, reinterest in this type of ancient mysticism, this type of older philosophy that offers an alternative to Christian colonial hegemony. And that's why I think it's in a period of, again, there's the kind of presently a revival and a kind of neo-fascistic version of this. And so it's again useful to look at the way that Thelema as a revolutionary tradition is linked to these earlier liberative modes of human thought. Before we look again at Albinus, I do want to say something about an alternative modern way of interpreting Platonism that might be a little bit more useful than the kind of metaphysical dualism that's going on in the text that we have before us. And that's to rethink the intelligible, not in terms of metaphysics, but in terms of a kind of transcendental semiotics. Is a kind of what Martin Heidegger would call a historicism of being, where rather than locating the form or intelligibility of the world in another world that's supernatural, to instead locate it in a kind of divine imaginative potential that is immanent in human existence. That the divine source and ground of being that produces the intelligibility of the world is a preeminently human activity, that we are ourselves the ground of being, And then we can treat what Plato calls the forms as the hermeneutical horizon or intelligibility of shared social language uses and social practices that we create as human beings and then are ourselves created by them, that we're in a kind of relationship of double reflection between historical context and objectivity and our own deep subjectivity and individual personal experience. And so those are, which we could also identify as hadith or nuit in Thelemic symbolism. And then there's a kind of dialectical union or interplay between these elements, and that gives rise to the possibility of the true will represented by the union of nuit and hadith, which is of course Ra Horkoid, as the image or symbol of the holy guardian angel, which is again, the highest point of the self or soul that communicates then this intelligibility. So it's a kind of, again, also this kind of internal mirroring or analogy of being between this larger world process of the arising of being, understood existentially and historically rather than metaphysically and dualistically, and then the rich, soupy, magical dialectic of that gives rise to our own unique self-expression. Anyway, there's a whole bunch more we could look at this text, and let me just show you one more thing that before I open to questions that relates directly to Thelemic symbolism, and that's in 16. So the Book of the Law says that every man and every woman is a star, right? Okay, well, it turns out that that derives from Hermetic Platonism, as at least one of the sources for that. Luke, if you want to go ahead again and read us 16 here.
When all things had been put in order by God, he still had left three types of mortal creatures, which were destined to be, namely the winged, the aquatic, and those that go on foot. He enjoyed the creation of these to the young gods.
He enjoined, he gave the creation, the
He
job of
enjoined,
creating
yes.
this.
Okay. He enjoined the creation of these to the young gods, lest they be immortal because they were fashioned by him. They then created the mortal species, after borrowing from primordial matter for specific periods of time, certain portions which are to be repaid to it again. Now, since the Father of all and the young gods were concerned about the human race as most akin to the gods, the creator of the universe sent down to the earth the souls of this species, equal in number to the stars. He then placed each soul in its kindred star as in a vehicle. And in order that he would be blameless, he explained to them all the laws of destiny as a lawgiver would.
Okay, stop at that point. Anyway, he gives this speech or lecture to the star souls as he's putting them in each body to, and so what's so interesting about that is it's this idea that each human soul has a specific analogy, is the embodiment of, in a way, one of the stars in heaven. And so each one of us, there's one star that's our star, and that's our connection to the highest order of being. And it even says that even while we're embodied, that star still remains our vehicle. So we're still connected with it through our nous, right? Our highest, the highest aspect of our own soul or self. And you've got the whole idea of the higher or divine daimon here, and of the knowledge and conversation of the holy guardian angel. and also of the idea of the star self symbolism in the Book of the Law. It's all right here in ancient Platonism. Okay, it's 3 o'clock and there's more stuff we can talk about this text. I do want to open up to questions at this point. So I'm now going to end the share. Great. And I want to open to questions. Some of this is in the chat. Joe, if you want to go ahead and repeat the question you have in the chat, or please go ahead and go for it.
Oh yeah. I was just gonna, well, I want to say this class is so amazing and I'm enjoying it so much, so thank you. I'm taking so many notes. And I guess I wanted you to ask if you could go a little bit more into when you said hermeneutical horizon, what that was. But I got excited because when you described that new interpretation of Platonism, that's kind of how I played with it in my mind, of like, oh, maybe the world of forms are like in here. It's like it's not this other world, but yeah.
That's right. That's right. And that's the basic idea. Whether that's I mean, there's a number of modern philosophers who are trying to modernize Platonism in a way, but get philosophically updated, you could say, by getting it away from its more otherworldly, older original form. So for Gilles Deleuze in France, important philosopher from kind of the era of the 60s. His proposal was to do something like what I've just described. So in a way, I'm kind of using him as a citation of an example of this type of idea. And his philosophy continues to inform a current French philosopher who's kind of popular right now by the name of Alain Badiou, most famous for a book he wrote called Being an Event, but he also wrote a bunch of other stuff. And he's also has this idea of a kind of updated Platonism, but the forms aren't in another world. They're just, again, the kind of form of this world, but again, it's informed particularly by the way that we specifically as human beings existentially relate to reality. That's the kind of fulcrum or the wellspring of the forms, and the place from which they emerge to then be attached through reference to whatever it is that's under, whatever the objects are that are then under discussion. And of course, the reason that's important is that we're not just when we're talking about objects of experience, we're not just talking about physical objects, we're also talking about objects of culture, and other types of ideas which are acknowledged as abstractions, even though we use them then to discuss classes of phenomenon that were the model subject-object is not always the best way to describe cognition, because, and here's where the idea of hermeneutics comes in, which is the idea that before we know or encounter things, we already have a pre-existing kind of grid work or matrix of concepts, expectations, identities, and so forth. We have really a whole social, cultural, and historical context that already forms the kind of source matrix of our experience. The usual metaphors is the kind of lens that we look through, which is, I think, is a little clumsy, but it's serviceable enough. But anyway, it provides the kind of framework or the view that we have, the perspective that then we're able to look out on and see things. And then Heidegger's example of this is to say that when we see a tree, it's because we already know what a tree is. If we didn't already know what a tree is, how would we know that that's a tree that we're looking at? And so no matter how natural the object is that we're looking at, it already has to fall within a kind of practical linguistic framework of usages that we socialize into as human beings for the world to have the kind of intelligibility it does to us, that it doesn't for, say, insects who have another kind of world that they're part of, but it's not our world. Or plants, which have a kind of world of experience that they're part of, but it isn't unified psychologically in the way plants don't have a mind. They're alive, but they're not alive in the way that we are. Well, how is it that we're alive then in a certain way that provides a kind of relation between us and our environment that is human in this particular historical way? Cows are alive and obviously have certain emotions and cognitions, but they don't have a history. They're not in history, and one day is just the same as another day for them. They're eating grass. That's what they do. That's all they do. That's perfectly fine for them, but it's not how human beings function, right? We have a history that we're part of that informs our identity. The narrative. Animals exist without a narrative, but human beings don't. We have a narrative. Well, where does that narrative come from? Well, it comes from human beings, right? But then what in a magical paradigm gives us our personal narrative? Well, it's some kind of coalescence, some kind of coming together of our own subjectivity. Okay, well, how do we mediate that? Well, there's a theurgic way to mediate that, which is through the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, right? Okay, that's the kind of higher aspect of your own self, which is also you, but it's also the best of what's you, that you're trying to creatively synthesize out of your magical experience that can then give you the big secret, can tell you who you are and what you're doing. And you're constructing it, but it's also constructing you. You have to get the flow going with that. And if it's not actually indeed flowing in both directions, it's got to have that feedback too. It's also has to be constructing you at the same time. And in that sense, be quote unquote objective. But of course, through an objectivity that isn't the same objectivity as the objectivity that, say, an object in physics would have, because it's not that kind of object. But that doesn't mean it's not an object of experience. You see what I mean? Anyway, does somebody else have a question they want to ask, or point of discussion that they want to raise, comment, critique, whatever you like? Are there any points of confusion or unclarity with regards to some of these admittedly complicated philosophical questions? For example, how is this system supposed to work or fit together, for example? And also how that might relate to what we're doing now. Yes, Luke, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, it's a great class, and I'm wondering how exactly, what's the exact difference between like the Platonism we're talking about here, which is like the historical, I guess, the philosophical, and the more like Neo-Platonism that kind of was more the influence, I guess, of the more modern Renaissance time.
Yes, particularly with Plotinus, but also Iamblichus. That's a very good question. Of course, although this is going to be the subject that we're going to be looking at over the next few classes, let me give you a little bit of a preview. There's a further explication of the particular stages or layers of this divine governance of the cosmos, this divine hierarchy. So in Plato, it's kind of vague. There's theos, or the highest good, which is at the height of the world of forms. There's this kind of world of forms. Sometimes he talks about a separate god that has the job of creating the universe that he calls a demiurge, that isn't a bad figure in any way. It's just a functionary of the, since the realm of forms exists in this kind of zone of abstraction, it can't directly act to create, because that would be considered as introducing an imperfection into the forms. So there has to be this intermediary layer that actually does the creating. So there's a separate God from the primordial God that actually creates the universe. Now, when you get to Christianity, that gets incorporated into Christianity, where the Son of God is separate from the Father, right? And the Son of God is said to be the Logos, the Word that creates, is the vehicle through which the world is created. Okay, that doesn't come from the Old Testament. That doesn't come from Judaism. That's a completely foreign idea to Torah religion. It comes from Greek Platonism, that's been interfused with Christianity, what's now called Christianity, to create the doctrine of the Trinity, which is a totally Greek philosophical idea. It doesn't have anything to do with the Torah observance. Now, of course, there's also a quote unquote Jewish version of this, where they start to play with a lot of these metaphysical Platonic ideas, and then that becomes Kabbalah. But we're a little bit looking at this from a slightly different angle. So the demiurge is like is then this creative function that's then called the Logos, that creates the universe. Okay, and then you've got some speculation, like in the Timaeus, about how physics works. So that's Plato, but none of this is complicated enough when you get to in the later Roman Empire, and it starts to get so for example, you need then to more further differentiate this layering between the ultimate ground of being and this creator deity. These need to be more fully differentiated from each other. So you have in Neoplatonism the creation of this ideal called, you have a separation of the realm of forms from the highest God, because these have to be separate, because the realm of forms is still diverse. It still has multiple forms in it. And the ultimate ground of being has to be complete unity. So this entity called the One is posited by Plotinus. This is an innovation. It's different from earlier Platonism, where the highest divine is just in the sort of realm of forms as a totality. You could talk about the good, the true, and the beautiful, but then Plotinus comes along and he says, this isn't good enough. I need to make a further discrimination. So all the diversity of forms that are in the realm of forms, and then the function of creating the universe, of imparting those forms to matter, all of that's the function of a separate divine being called the demiurge, which is distinct, which is completely distinct from this other higher being called the One. And so then various issues arise as to how high the form of the rational in you can ascend in contemplation. Can you ascend to the level of the demiurge and only that high, or can you get higher? And what does that mean? And there's a theory of mysticism about that. And all of this is further speculative elaboration from Plato. Then what Iamblichus does is he introduces the concept of theurgy, of ceremonial magic, rites and rituals that are practiced in temples, mostly divination involving animal sacrifice, but there are other things that you do. And his idea is that the soul can be energized into mystical union with the One, all the way at the top, but this is only preeminently done through rituals, not through meditative contemplation. And so he has a different view than Plotinus does about this. And then there's a whole functioning of the personal daimon, or a kind of guardian spirit that's assigned to each soul by the divine governance of the universe. And then you have to create a personal cultist to get into communication with that. They can then tell you how to achieve theurgic union. So, and then of course, that's then the basis for that more robust form detailed form of Platonism. That's then the basis for what is going on with the magic to invoke the higher and divine self in the Golden Dawn, for example, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, because they're a Hermetic order that's attempting to practice theurgic union, but that's being understood through this Iamblican framework that is mediated through the Renaissance, but then also the later, and all of that lands in Crowley's lap as he's creating his own version of that with Thelema. And so, again, my point of having these classes to show how this is all based on this actually robustly complex, culturally important stuff that is in the past that maybe we don't know so much about now. But none of this is new. None of this is like cooked up yesterday, that we're part of this. We really are part of this ancient tradition. And so the more we know about that, the more gnosis, if you will, we have about what we're doing. And also the increased kind of critical relationship that we can have with it. We can be more creative with that, less dogmatic, because we don't have to see this as some faith that just we're handed it and we're supposed to believe it. No, this is a philosophical theory that's based in a spiritual practice that can be experimentally confirmed or worked with and experienced. And what I'm saying is that's the more constructive way to approach it, rather than turn it into another version of Protestant faith, where we have, little drinking party cliques where we get to pat ourselves on the back that we're the saved ones. And, my concern for kind of the condition of theology of the larger neo-pagan community, particularly in witchcraft or Wicca or other maybe more numerically large parts of that community than our own, is the way that it's, I think neo-pagan theology has been kind of moribund for about 20 years. And the reason is because it's more and more slid into this kind of Protestant mold, which re-Protestantized itself. And this is, on the one hand, a sign of its success in mass culture, because it's able to function completely coherently in that kind of WASP consensus space of American consumer culture. But it also loses its liberative distinction by doing that, because it then, in a sense, becomes re-Christianized in a way that I want to kind of take us back to this older, more complicated, messy pagan background that I think is more useful and interesting, and get away from the kind of identity politics basis for a lot of neo-pagan religion right now in American consumer culture, and be open to seeing this more as a kind of radical philosophy again. But that does require doing a little bit more work. So, for a lot of pagans, the most radical thing they did is that, 30 or 40 years ago, they converted to being a witch or whatever. And then they were kind of done because they were with the right people, and they haven't given it much thought since then. And I'm sorry, this is too derogatory. I mean this is kind of comedic oversimplification, obviously, but the point that I'm trying to make is that if we're going to get anywhere with any kind of magical or neo-pagan scene or culture as having some kind of avant-garde relevance again, I think we've got to get our game up again with the philosophy of what we're doing. And the first step of that is to understand the historical context that we're part of, that maybe has gone a little bit fuzzy. And if we can just sharpen that up a little bit, bring it into more focus, I think that a lot of the stuff that currently in the Thelemic corpus has gone a little bit vague in its relevance. We can see, oh, this part over here, he's referring to this. And this part, this relates to that idea over here. And some of the philosophical coherence of what Crowley is doing can become apparent to us again and useful again. And within that context, the more faith-like aspirational aspect of what we're doing can also revivify itself because it has a coherent basis that isn't just, let's have another drinking party of the elect. Anybody can go to their evangelical club down the street and do that with some Christians. I just think it's boring. It's irrelevant. It doesn't, there's so much more rich, interesting stuff that we could be basing what we're doing on and talking about. And at a point in time where with the internet and we have access to more information than ever on a mass cultural level, that it should have this impoverished, postmodern, commodity reified form is regrettable. And, all we have to do is just get together and try to do something else, and other things might become possible. I think we've got time for maybe one or two more questions, comments. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
When you mentioned the demiurge, could that be related in the context of Neoplatonism? Could that be related to the mind maker entity in the Pymander Poimandres? Are those the same, or are they related? And my second question is there a specific parallel between the Christian Trinity and the I know you said that there was like the ultimate God, the demiurge, and the world of forms. Would those be the three kind of equivalent?
I think what I would say about that is that when you get into the medieval period, there is a strong, Aristotle is the strongest influence in Christians just who are still bothering to do philosophy. But because Augustine was a Platonist, there is still this Augustinian Platonism that has a life in the medieval tradition, and particularly in mysticism and the Christian contemplative tradition during that time. And so setting aside what Muslims or Jews are doing with Sufism or Kabbalah, that also has its own parallelisms with that, and just looking at the medieval Christian tradition, there is an attempt by them to assimilate certain ideas from Neoplatonism into ideas of the Trinity or ways to work pneumatology with that, where the Father could be considered the one as the ground of being, and then the Logos or Demiurge is the Son as Christ, and then there would be a place for Sophia or the world soul having some relationship to the pneumatology of the Holy Spirit. And so you could get the one, the Logos and Sophia as some kind of analog to the Trinity. There's not a lot of emphasis on the Holy Spirit in the Latin Christian tradition as much as there is in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, where there's much more of a pneuma-focused spirituality, and also more focus on the Platonic as opposed to the Aristotelian part of the inheritance into Christianity of antiquity. And so you do get Sophistic mysticism in where they're attempting to achieve a kind of theosis, or making of themselves into a union with God that I think has explicitly direct parallels with energizing the soul to achieve theurgic union with the one in Neoplatonism. And this is intended to be the case. And their Proclus sometimes serves as an intermediary figure, and particularly a kind of gloss on Proclus's philosophy by this other figure called Pseudo-Dionysus. And so that's a place to look for ways that this particular form of theurgic Neoplatonism does have a Christian version. And of course, it also has a Kabbalistic version, and it also has a version in Sufism as well, in Islamic mysticism. So all of these things are, these traditions, even though paganism becomes illegal and can't be practiced anymore, its wisdom is, of course, incorporated into these later, subsequently hegemonic monotheistic traditions. And then what's important about the Renaissance is you have an explicit paganism begins to break out again. What Peter Gay calls modern paganism, identified with modernity itself in a way as a kind of Gnosticism. And in a way, that's the paradigm that in modern technological secular society we're kind of participating in, a kind of consumer capitalist version of that. And these traditional medieval monotheisms continue to exist, but they're now your personal faith. And so they no longer have the place in the public sphere that they did before. And, there's politics around that. But anyway, I don't know if that's helpful and answer your question. We've got just a few moments more. Anybody else want to jump in? Taryn, do you have anything to say to close us out?
No, but a fascinating lecture. Thank you so much.
Okay, good. I want to note next time we're going to be talking about skepticism and the ambiguities of skepticism and how skepticism is practiced in ancient times. And we're going to have a close reading of Crowley's essay, The Soldier and the Hunchback, and talk about, we're going to be looking at a Crowley text at this point for next week and try to relate a lot of what we've been looking at back to Thelema a little bit more directly. And then there's some more stuff later, but that's for next week. So there's a short text that's kind of the introduction of Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, which itself is a wonderful text. It's too bad we won't have time to look more at that text, one of my very favorite texts on ancient philosophy. Anyway, we'll have some more to say about that, but particularly what Cicero has to say about skepticism. And I'll be using him as an example of what it actually means to be a practitioner of skepticism practically in ancient times, not just theoretically, but socially and practically, and how that relates to how we should understand skepticism in modern times. And I'll have some things to say about David Hume and this thing called the Scottish Enlightenment, because that's the particular type of skepticism that Aleister Crowley is most interested in, and then how that works in this particular text of in the Thelemic tradition, and then also how skepticism works in Thelemic magic and why it's important, and why we should be practicing it, but also what that means and the ambiguities and complexities of that. And all of that brings with it. So thanks everybody for joining us. I'm going to log out. So love is the law, love under will.